the second keynote lecture of our conference. It's a great privilege for me to introduce Professor Mark Kramer, one of the world leading experts on the Eastern Bloc history, who is currently the director of Cold War Studies at Harvard University, a senior fellow of Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, and the director of Harvard's Sakharov program on human rights. Mark Kramer has published numerous books and articles dealing with the post-war events in the Eastern Europe, and he's going to present his lecture titled "The Communist Party of Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union During the Crises in the Eastern Bloc between 1948 and 1989. So, Professor Kramer, the floor is yours.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. I am very pleased to be taking part in today's conference. It's too bad we are not able to have it in person in Prague, which is my favorite city. But still, I'm very glad the conference is being held this week. I should note that Mate Bili, and I'm very grateful to him for inviting me to take part, has mentioned the Sakharov program that I direct at Harvard, and tomorrow is the 100th anniversary of Sakharov's birth. So there is an event that we are having there as well. But today I'm very glad to be taking part in the conference, and there are many scholars also taking part, some who spoke yesterday, and that I've known for many years, and I'm very pleased to be speaking with them as well. People like Vít Smetana and Oldřich Tuma and many others. So let me, I'm going to have to cover a lot of ground, and I'll have to do this quite quickly. If I begin to run out of time, I'm going to compress it some because I really want to focus on the last few crises. But even before the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia seized power in February 1948, the party was very closely aligned with the Soviet Union. In many ways, when it was created in 1921, it was largely a creation of the Soviet Union. This was true throughout the interwar period when Czechoslovak communists worked closely with Soviet officials in the Comintern, the Communist International, which was entirely Soviet dominated, even though it had its operations throughout the world. And it's not to say that people operating in different countries were brain dead automatons who simply did the bidding of the Moscow authorities, but still, is no question the Comintern was a Soviet organ and was very heavily dominated by the Soviet Union. The period of Nazi-Soviet alignment from August 1939 to June 1951, which was after the Czech lands had been occupied by German forces in March 1939, posed a lot of uncomfortable complications for Czech and Slovak communists, especially for Czech communists, who, among other things, were ordered by the Comintern on behalf of the Soviet Union to cease any protests against the German occupation of the Czech lands. That was as a result of the Soviet Union's alignment with Nazi Germany during the 20 months of the Nazi-Soviet pact. So that embarrassing period in Soviet relations was brought to an end by the start of Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941, which once again allowed the Czechoslovak communists to oppose the Nazis because they had been forbidden to do so by the Soviet Union prior to from August 1939 until 22nd June 1941. During the war, Czech and Slovak communists sought to work closely, and I realized that Czech and Slovak communists were operating quite separately. And I know this, I very much welcome that the conference has dealt seriously with Slovakia. which at times is often left out of Czech narratives of the communist period. But the Slovak communists operated quite separately, and I'm very glad the conference is looking at that. But they sought to work closely with Soviet forces, and some high-ranking Czechoslovak communists lived in the USSR. Among these was Alexander Dubček. The role of the Red Army in driving German forces out of Czechoslovakia and its impact on sentiment in early post-war Czechoslovakia is crucial to understanding the subsequent development of the whole history of Czechoslovakia after the war. That as Vít Smetana and many others, Bradley Abrams in English, and Vít also in English, but numerous others have pointed out that it crucially cemented the Soviet Igor Lukács, the Soviet role in Czechoslovakia, and particularly the Beneš government, dependent on Soviet forces even before the communists took over. Let me also mention Gustav Husak, who was among the Slovak communists who approached Stalin in 1944 who were anxious about returning to a unified Czechoslovakia and proposed to have Slovakia be incorporated into the Soviet Union instead. There's no indication that Stalin seriously considered this proposal. He certainly heard it, could have taken it up if he had wanted, but did not pursue it. There were portions of Czechoslovakia, of course, that were annexed. What is now part of Ukraine, Transcarpathia, Ruthenia, that was annexed by the Soviet Union. But Stalin never, there's no indication that he seriously considered annexing Slovakia as well, despite the exhortations of some Slovak communists. That period from May 1945 to February 1948 was one in which, again, the Czechoslovak communists were heavily dependent during this time on the Soviet Union, but were also operating in their own accord to some extent, probably a bit more gung-ho about pushing ahead than some Soviet officials yet were, partly because of the complex relationship between Beneš and Stalin. The Soviet forces, as has been discussed at the conference, pulled out of Czechoslovakia in December 1945, which is an event that is a very important one to understanding. I don't have time to deal with it here, but I'm glad again that this event is being discussed at the conference, because the role of the Czechoslovak communists in this is again, I think, an important element to understand for the conference. The role of Czech intellectuals, and this was non-communist intellectuals I'm talking about here, and bringing on the communist takeover, has been discussed very well by numerous people. Bradley Abrams published an excellent book about this around 15 or so, 10 to 15 years ago. Vít Smetana discusses it at length in a chapter that he published in a book that came out in 2013, I think, that is in English. So the role of that, though, is a very important one that I don't have time to discuss, but I'm glad it is being discussed at the conference. The Soviet Union and the February 1948 coup d'etat, clearly the Soviet Union was an important element in it, but the Czechoslovak communists ultimately took the major role in this, but with the knowledge that they had full Soviet support. They wouldn't have acted if, for some reason, the Soviet Union had not wanted it. So I say all this, this is basically just the prelude to the major points that I want to get to. Over the next 41 years, that is from February 1948 until November 1989, maybe a few months before November, because it was pretty clear, I think, to quite a few Czechoslovak communists that they were losing the potential to rely on Soviet support in the event of a domestic crisis, certainly after Erich Honecker's overthrow in October, but I'll get to that a bit later. So the ruling Communist Party in Czechoslovakia staunchly supported Soviet policy during all major and minor crises in the Eastern Bloc, with two notable exceptions. And I'm going to deal with both of those exceptions, but I realize each of them is being discussed at the conference, and so I will deal with them only in looking at how this affected the Soviet Union's relationship with the party. These are very familiar to everyone in Prague. The events of 1968 and the upheavals of 1989. Both of those events have been explored exhaustively by Czech and Slovak scholars in the post-1989 period. Excellent scholarship has appeared in both countries. Commissions have been set up to deal with them. So I will touch only very superficially on these events, but in a way that comes back to the theme of my lecture. In August 1968, the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia, as everyone knows, to dislodge the reformist leaders of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. And in 1989, the Soviet Union stayed on the sidelines when the other hardline communist parties in Warsaw Pact countries were forced out of power. And that was a very conscious policy to stay on the sidelines. It wasn't just something that happened by accident, and I will come back to that. So let me turn first to the first major crisis in the Soviet bloc, one that actually resulted ultimately in the loss of one important member of the Soviet bloc, which was Yugoslavia. Stalin in June 1948, it had gone back before that, but in June 1948 expelled Yugoslavia from the Cominform, the Communist Information Bureau. That I don't have time to go into the reasons for that. I've written an article that looks at the reasons as well as the consequences of this split. But the point I want to emphasize here today is that Czechoslovakia, even though nowhere near Yugoslavia, but it joined with the other East Bloc countries in imposing trade sanctions against Yugoslavia and taking other measures to try to ostracize Yugoslavia, and especially to get rid of Tito. So from January, there was, more importantly, though, as a result of a secret meeting that Stalin held in Moscow in January 1951, in which he gave orders to the other East Bloc countries to embark on crash military buildups to prepare for a war that Stalin clearly believed was coming. It doesn't necessarily mean that Stalin himself was planning to launch this war, but he very clearly, from his remarks at this conference, believed that war was coming and wanted to be prepared to fight and win it. So the Soviet Union itself embarked on a crash military buildup during the final 2 years of Stalin's life, nearly doubling the size of its armed forces, procuring much more modern weapons, speeding up the development of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had tested its first nuclear weapon in August 1949 and was speeding up the development of them because at the time there was only a very limited quantity of them, and also sped up the development of thermonuclear weapons. So in the Soviet Union itself, there was a crash military buildup, but more importantly in Czechoslovakia, as in the other East Bloc countries, a frenzied military buildup began that militarized the Czechoslovak economy to a significant extent. It did have some healthy consequences in modernizing Czechoslovak industry, which was already far more developed than in most East Bloc countries. But it also skewed it heavily toward the military sector, and that had important consequences in later years. So the rest of what I want to emphasize here then is that during this crisis, with Yugoslavia, which ultimately was resolved against the Soviet bloc. That is, Yugoslavia was able to stand in defiance of the Soviet bloc and not have to yield. That during that time, though, Czechoslovakia stood firmly with the Soviets. Stalin's death in March 1953 and the uprisings in Czechoslovakia and East Germany in June 1953 are the next event I want to touch on briefly. The militarization of the Czechoslovak economy that I mentioned, which was undertaken at Stalin's behest, it kept living standards low, much lower than they would have been, because Czechoslovakia was potentially a wealthy country. But it kept living standards low and created significant fiscal problems, as has now been documented very thoroughly by Czech economic historians. The currency reform in Czechoslovakia that was implemented on the 30th of May in 1953, which was inspired by Soviet planners. It was largely implemented as a result of that. It was not particularly, the Czechoslovak officials were much more hesitant about it, but the Soviet Union really pushed it, as it was pushing changes in other East Bloc countries, especially Hungary and East Germany. And that resulted in a further de facto drop in living standards that sparked a large-scale uprising in Pilsen. There was unrest elsewhere, including in Prague, but the violent unrest was in Pilsen on the 1st of June, 1953, when protesters took to the streets, burned Soviet flags, defaced Soviet statues, denounced Soviet influence in Czechoslovakia. So it indicated there was certainly an awareness in segments of the Czech public, and I emphasize Czech here because it wasn't a result that simply Czechs were still grateful to the Soviet Union for its role in driving the German forces out of Czechoslovakia, but there was already significant hostility toward the Soviet Union by June 1953. It doesn't mean that that was the dominant sentiment, but certainly on the part of significant segments of the public. The Czechoslovak Communist Party was able to suppress the uprising on its own without Soviet assistance. There was never any need for that. The People's Militia and other security forces were called in, but the upheaval in Pilsen and what it meant for the was soon overshadowed by the mass uprising in 600 cities and more than 600 cities and towns in East Germany on the 17th of June 1953, just a couple of weeks later, which spiraled out of control until 18 Soviet divisions intervened to crush the rebellion. So what had happened, the very important events that had happened in Czechoslovakia itself on the 1st of June were overshadowed by what had happened in East Germany. And so as a result, this episode was largely overlooked, or it's certainly not given the emphasis it really deserved, because it was so much overshadowed by what had happened in Germany. So let me turn to the crises that I really want to focus on, and I realize I'm already probably beginning to approach the limits of my time, but I'm going to try to speak for about another 15 minutes, if that's okay. So the Poland and Hungary, first of all, in June 1956 in Poland, during the when there was a large-scale uprising, a very violent uprising in Poznan in Poland in June 1956, and then the revolution in Hungary in November 1956. This had been preceded by the whole thrust of de-Stalinization, which really began with Stalin's death very promptly after. It wasn't just Trueschoff's secret speech in February 1956. It had really dated back to the time that Malenkov had succeeded Stalin initially, and then was fairly quickly replaced by Trueschoff as the dominant figure. but the de-Stalinization had begun earlier, but its real impact came as a result of Khrushchev's secret speech. But still, there were in Czechoslovakia as early as January 1956, there were de-Stalinizing protests in Prague and Bratislava. This was really well before Khrushchev's secret speech. And they spoke openly against the Czechoslovak regime's decision to require all male students to undergo a year of military service after completing their education. So it's important, I think, to emphasize this, just to indicate that the public sentiment was still quite volatile. The Khrushchev reactions to the violent uprising in Poland, in Poznan specifically in June 1956, are ones that I documented at some length in an article several years ago. But that they viewed the situation in Poland with great alarm, realizing that potentially would spark, not directly spark unrest, but there might be similar bouts of unrest elsewhere. And I mentioned that it's quite interesting to look at some of the reactions in Prague during this time, because people were very well aware of how violent it had been in Poznan, that they needed to bring in more than 10,000 troops to suppress the rebellion. Initially, they were unable to suppress it, and it took 2 to 3 days of fighting before they were able to. And you can see photos, that very valuable compilation that Pavel Maciejewicz put together in Poland about 10 years ago of photos from the fighting. And some of those photos actually came from Prague, because that somehow Czechoslovak officials had obtained photos of the fighting in Poznan. It's still not clear to me how that was. But in any case, there was as a result of that, there were steps being taken in Czechoslovakia to try to prevent any such occurrence in Czechoslovakia itself. There was a surge of concern in Prague again, and I'm specifically focusing on Prague here because this was a case of dealing with other countries. So it was the Czechoslovak authorities who were dealing with this. The surge of concern in October 1956 about the unrest in Hungary and its spillover into the Hungarian inhabited regions of Slovakia. And there was certainly concern in Slovakia itself as well. I don't have time to go into that now, but suffice to say that this was one of the elements that affected the Czechoslovak authorities' response to the crisis in 1956. The Soviet KGB itself was both reporting to the Czechoslovak authorities and certainly to Trueschoff about the spillover into Slovakia. Some of those reports have been declassified now and are available in GARF in Moscow. They reached Trueschoff and were also discussed at some of the Soviet Presidium meetings in October and November 1956. So Novotny and his colleagues watched with alarm as the crisis in Hungary deepened. Novotny himself attended the Soviet Presidium meeting on the 24th of October 1956, where other East Bloc leaders were present because Trueschoff wanted to present to them what had happened in Hungary and also what the Soviet Union was doing. On the 2nd of November 1956, Novotny again met with Trueschoff and Malenkov. This came 2 days after the Soviet Union had decided to invade Hungary again with a much larger force. That invasion took place on the 4th of November 1956, but Trueschoff and Malenkov went around to the different East Bloc leaders to inform them about what was going to happen. Novotny offered to send Czechoslovak forces to help with in subduing the uprising, as did, by the way, the Romanian the Romanians did as well. Gugudesh in Romania made a similar offer, but Trueschoff turned down those offers of assistance. He wanted simply Soviet troops to deal with it for reasons that I can get to if anyone's interested, but he didn't want the offers of assistance, in contrast to what happened in 1968. So nonetheless, it was very obvious, though, that Czechoslovak policy was firmly aligned with the Soviet Union throughout this crisis, that there was no difference of view between Czechoslovak communists and Soviet communists. In 1968, though, is very different. The Prague Spring began with the removal of Novotny as the head of the Communist Party in December 1967, and the election of Alexander Dubček as Novotny's successor a few weeks later. Leonid Brezhnev, who had never been particularly close to Novotny, had been very uneasy about the removal of Trueschoff in October 1964, and as a result, Brezhnev's relationship with Novotny was quite chilly overall. So Brezhnev had tacitly, at least, consulted to the change of leadership in Prague in December 1967, and had initially been quite confident that Dubček, who had lived many years in the USSR, would be a reliable partner for the Soviet Union. But by early March 1968, and again, I'm not going to have time to cover the events of 1968 in any detail, so I'm just going to touch fairly superficially on a few points that I want to bring out. That as wide-ranging political and economic reforms began to take hold in Czechoslovakia, Soviet leaders became increasingly uneasy about the trend of the Prague Spring. And despite Dubček's assurances, Soviet leaders feared that traditional channels of Soviet influence in Czechoslovakia were being eroded and undermined.
A navzdory Dubčekovým ujištěním se sovětští představitelé obávali, že tradiční kanály sovětského vlivu v Česku
foreign alignments per se, although there was also growing unease about that. The unease in Moscow was similarly reinforced particularly by Vladislav Gomulka in Poland and Walter Ulbricht in East Germany, who were even at least as alarmed, probably more alarmed than Soviet leaders about what was going on in Czechoslovakia. Both Gomulka and Ulbricht had been around in power for many years and were coming to the end of their tenures, but they certainly did not want what was going on in Czechoslovakia to contribute to their demise. The concerns expressed by Polish and East German leaders, combined with the grave apprehension that senior officials in Moscow were beginning to feel, induced the Soviet Politburo to give high priority to the so-called Czechoslovak question. There was a commission established on Czechoslovakia under the Politburo. Brezhnev headed that commission. Few of the records of it have been made available at Brigani, but most of them are still at the Presidential Archive. But still, there's a great deal that is accessible, overwhelming amount of documentation now accessible, including the transcripts of many of the Politburo meetings, one of the few episodes about which some of the full transcripts of Politburo meetings actually are available. So the Soviet Politburo meetings. From mid-March 1968 on, the issue was constantly at the top of the Politburo's agenda. Brezhnev consulted and worked closely with his Politburo colleagues on all aspects of the crisis to ensure that responsibility for the outcome would be borne collectively, even if Brezhnev, as the leader, bore the chief responsibility. He wanted to share it in a way that was to some extent similar to what Khrushchev did in 1956, but Khrushchev did it more not on his own, but certainly as the dominant figure, more so, I think, than Brezhnev, who tended to work more collectively. So as the rift between the KSH and the Soviet Union widened in the spring of 1968, the Soviet Politburo authorized Soviet Defense Minister Marshal Andrei Grechko to to begin preparing Soviet forces in Eastern Europe for a large-scale military contingency. And that led ultimately to the invasion of Czechoslovakia in August 1968. The transcripts of Soviet Politburo meetings from 1968 reveal that some members, such as Yuri Andropov, Nikolai Podgorny, and Petro Shelist, were consistent supporters of military intervention, really quite vehemently supportive of intervention, whereas others, particularly Mikhail Suslov, were far more circumspect, and others like Kosygin would go back and forth. Brezhnev himself tended to do that as well. So let me, because for the sake of time, I'm going to skip some of this, except to say that Brezhnev used a variety of bilateral channels to urge Dubček and other senior Czechoslovak officials to combat the so-called anti-socialist and counter-revolutionary elements. That those appeals, Dubček was mindful that Brezhnev was trying to get him to crack down internally, but those appeals ultimately had no effect. Brezhnev did want an internal solution. That's why this crisis, unlike in 1956, when Soviet troops were sent in immediately after unrest broke out in Hungary, is here in Czechoslovakia in 1968. It was a much more protracted effort to bring about an internal solution in Czechoslovakia. And Brezhnev spoke by phone with Dubček on the 9th and 13th of August. The transcripts of these phone conversations were released in 1994 at a conference held that was held in Prague. Rudolf Pichoya, the head of the Soviet Archival Service, brought these transcripts. And I remember I did an impromptu translation of them because I wasn't sure we'd be able to keep them, but fortunately we were. And those phone conversations made clear that Brezhnev was really, it was a last-ditch effort to get Dubček to crack down. But after the phone calls, Brezhnev heard quite different things. It's a very clear indication where the two leaders will be speaking at odds with one another and will hear things very differently. So Brezhnev concluded, though, that nothing more can be expected from the current Czech Presidium and that a military solution can no longer be avoided. I'm going to skip the consequences of that, of the invasion, except to say that ultimately, because the so-called healthy forces in the Czechoslovak Communist Party were unable to gain majority support on the Presidium, that the Soviet Politburo had to reopen negotiations with Dubček and others. So forth. All of this is so well known in Prague that I'm not going to go through any of it. Reports from Soviet diplomats in late 1968 confirmed that even most Communist Party members viewed the invasion in, quote, highly negative terms. The anger and widespread resentment toward the Soviet Union had to be countered by sustained repression and normalization. And so that was the state of things by the end of 1968. The invasion, however, from Soviet perspective, did prove to be largely successful in almost all other respects. It was able to restore communist orthodoxy and to solidify the Soviet bloc for another 21 years. The promulgation of the Brezhnev Doctrine in August-September 1968 made this very explicit, that the security of socialist countries was indivisible and that the Soviet Union had both a right and a duty to intervene if socialism was threatened. And that remained Soviet policy until 1989. So let me turn quickly then to the final two events I want to discuss. And I realize I've already gone past my time, and I apologize. I'll take another 5 minutes, but I hope that's okay. The 1980-81 Polish crisis was extremely important in revealing the potential for change to happen in Eastern Europe from below. This was very clearly from below. In 1956, it was, and earlier in 1953 and 1956 in Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Poland, and Hungary, it had also been the case. But there had never been anything on the scale of what happened in Poland in 1980-81. Unlike in 1968, the Czechoslovak Communist Party under Gustav Husak was fully aligned with the Soviet Union in seeking to crush this mass reform movement that emerged, Solidarność. On the 26th of August 1980, the Soviet Politburo adopted a resolution to mobilize forces, in the phrase used, in case military assistance is provided to Poland. The formation of Solidarity, which was really what Soviet leaders were reacting with unremitting hostility to it. And the same was true that the very similar reactions in all East Bloc capitals, including Romania. Romania would sometimes take a different position on matters, but not about what was going on in Poland, is that all East Bloc leaders were alarmed by it and wanted the Polish leaders to crush Solidarity. And that was certainly true of Gustav Husak. As in 1968, with Czechoslovakia, Soviet leaders hoped that an internal solution would work out and would render external military intervention unnecessary. But Soviet leaders were willing to have up to a dozen Soviet Army divisions, plus 2 Czechoslovak divisions and one East German division. It should be not divisions. Assist the Polish authorities in implementing martial law. So even though there had been a lot of concerns after 1968 about the reliability of the Czechoslovak army, it is not correct to say, as Condi Rice does in a book she published quite a few years ago, about 3 decades ago, about the Czechoslovak army. It's simply not correct to say that the Soviet Union was no longer willing to rely on it. In fact, the military planning did envisage the intervention of 2 Czechoslovak divisions if intervention had been needed in Poland, even though the hope was that an internal solution would be feasible. So here it underscored that the Soviet Union and the Czechoslovak Communist Party were once again working in the same direction toward the preservation of Orthodox communist rule in the Soviet bloc. It's the same pattern we saw in 1948 and 1953 and 1956. What had happened in 1968 was very different, but in 1980-81, we saw the same pattern in which Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia worked exactly along the same lines. So that brings me finally to 1989, when the Soviet Union abandoned the Czechoslovak Communist Party in its moment of danger. And that was, as I mentioned a bit earlier, that was not just by accident. That is, it wasn't simply through force of circumstance. In March 1989, 26th of March 1989, the Soviet Politburo secretly adopted a resolution not to use military force to preserve communist rule in Eastern Europe. The only circumstance in which Soviet military force would be used in Eastern Europe was to defend against external attack, that is, the NATO attack, which no one expected. So it was very clear that what was being adopted here was a resolution not to use military force to uphold communist regimes. And again, the discussion of this indicates that there were secret agreements that had been made in the past, some of them unwritten, as was indicated, but as was indicated in the documents, but others that had been made to commit the use of Soviet forces to preserve communist regimes in East Germany and Czechoslovakia specifically. There were such commitments. Those were essentially annulled by this resolution in March 1989. That resolution was put to the test in subsequent months, and in each case, the Soviet Union stuck by its decision. In the specific case of Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union's inaction during the Velvet Revolution in November 1989 brought an end to communist rule in the country. Gorbachev's close aide, Alexander Yakovlev, actually publicly welcomed the peaceful change in Czechoslovakia. He was asked about on the day after the Velvet Revolution began. Yakovlev was asked about this by a Western journalist, and he, far from condemning what was going on in Czechoslovakia, he actually welcomed it openly, and thus sealed the Czechoslovak Communist Party's fate at that point. So I end then just with a few quick conclusions. One, what is interesting in looking at the relationship between the Soviet Union and the Czechoslovak Communist Party is that it did highlight the power disparity between the two, that there was never any question looking at the outcome of crises that the Czechoslovak Communist Party would somehow emerge triumphant on its own, the way the Yugoslav communists were able to after Stalin's death. But each time that the challenge came between the Czechoslovak Communist Party and the Soviet Union in 1968 and 1989, the agenda was ultimately determined by the Soviet Union. Second would be the 21 years of post-1968 normalization in Czechoslovakia did not provide a viable foundation for communist rule without Soviet military backing. It's not to say that there was not. It doesn't mean that again it was simply a question of the Czech and Slovak public waiting until they had the chance to get rid of communist rule, but there was never any kind of solid normative commitment to the regime. That helps explain why everything came to an end so quickly in 1989, when suddenly became clear the Soviet Union was no longer going to support. And the final point is the Czechoslovak Communist Party was subordinated to Soviet preferences throughout its existence. On the only occasions when the two parties failed to achieve a meeting of the minds in 1968 and 1989, the outcome for the Czechoslovak Communist Party was extremely detrimental. And the legacy of subordination to the Soviet Communist Party largely undermined the viability of the KSČ after 1989, even though it continued to exist as a Communist Party after 1989. And I realize it has still exists to this day, but still it has never been able to think about somehow regain. There's never been a prospect of a return to communism in Czechoslovakia. So I end there then, and I'm sorry for going over time.
Thank you, Professor Kramer.
I'll stop the sharing. Hold on one second. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Kramer, for your very comprehensive lecture. We have now time for a few questions. So let me ask the first one. Your lecture was primarily about the Eastern Bloc crises, but we should not miss the fact that between 1948 and 1989, there were quite long periods when the Czechoslovak communist rule looked stable. And there is a frequently asked question, what was the main source of that relative stability? What is your opinion on this matter?
Well, I mean, it's an excellent question. From 1945 until 1968, there were no Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia. So it's very clear that it wasn't simply a question of having Soviet troops present. From August 1968 until 1991, I guess it was, that when Soviet troops left, let's just say from August 1968 until 1989, Soviet troops were present. And So we have periods of roughly equal length in which you can compare, and you wouldn't say that Czechoslovak communism after the normalization was any less stable than it had been from December 1945 until 1968. So it isn't a question simply of Soviet troops, although undoubtedly the presence of Soviet troops after August 1968 deterred any further such reform movement within the Czechoslovak Communist Party from ever forming again. But there's no question that Czechoslovak communists were quite skillful after 1940, after February 1948, in using certain features of events that had happened during the Beneš period to their advantage, particularly about distributing resources to various groups after nationalization of industries and other such facilities that they were able to do. But some of that was undermined to a large extent during the militarization of the Czechoslovak economy that occurred in the early 1950s. And that's why I think you did see the unrest break out in 1953. So there was certainly always, and if you look at some of the secret police reports as well, you can see that in segments of society, there was anxiety about Czechoslovakia's relationship with the Soviet Union and its subordination to the Soviet Union and its and also about the nature of communism. But you can also find in other documents, you can also see a great deal of social support for elements of the communist structures in Czechoslovakia. And, given that in any, with relatively few exceptions, there are some countries in which unrest is endemic, and you have periodic outbreaks of violence, Somalia or Afghanistan or Iraq since 2003. So there are some countries in which you will see unrest, but most countries over time, periods of unrest and domestic instability are relatively uncommon. And that, all of that, I think, contributed to the perception of stability and social support in Czechoslovakia during the communist era. That despite the resentment, even among those who resented the Soviet Union, they weren't necessarily willing to take to the streets to act on it, much less those who supported the Soviet Union. So it wasn't sufficient factor or reason, catalyst for mass unrest in Czechoslovakia.
Thank you very much. We have a question by Jan Wilhan on our YouTube chat. Was there any possibility that the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia would have called the Soviet Union to intervene in the country in case that coup attempt in 1948 wouldn't have worked?
Yeah, I mean, that remains a topic of considerable research. There are a couple of Russian scholars, Tatiana Volikitina and Galina Murashko, who, though she's now dead, but Volikitina is still very much alive and have had access to the presidential archive as well as the foreign ministry archive and others to try to pin down what the Soviet Union was planning to do in the event of a failed coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia. It does seem that there was preparation, at least, for intervention in Czechoslovakia, but the documentation, much of the documentation on that has not yet been released. It's still at the presidential archive, and there is also material that has not been released, even though I have tried my best from the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense in Russia that I tried to get the specific contingency plans that had been drafted for Czechoslovakia in February 1948, and they did not yet release them. I still have requests in for those, and I hope that when I'm next in Moscow, which I hope will be fairly soon. I haven't been there over the past year because of travel restrictions, but I'm hoping they'll open the country again later this year. I'll see what the status of that is. But suffice to say, in response to the question, that there are indications the Soviet Union was prepared to take military action, but that's very different from saying it actually would have. It's the type of situation where the same happened in Poland in December 1981. That the Soviet Union was prepared, if needed, to use military force in Poland, but it wanted events to be handled internally. And it's always hard to know whether military intervention definitely would have happened. And the same is true, I would say, in Czechoslovakia in February 1948. The goal was to have the Czechoslovak communists seize power on their own. And it's purely hypothetical, but still important to know what the Soviet Union might have done if that had not succeeded, even though they were confident it would succeed as it did.
Thank you so much. We have another question by Dr. Tomáš Malinek, our colleague at the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes. He asks Professor Kramer if he can find any differences between Soviet and Czechoslovak attitude towards the Berlin crisis in 1961.
Yeah, no, there really wasn't any difference of view. I didn't deal with some of the other East-West crises because I just wanted to focus on crises in the Eastern Bloc. But that is a very important question about how Czechoslovakia aligned with the Soviet Union during crises with the West. The one that I would point to even more than 1961, although I'll come back to that in a minute, but was in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that Soviet Union acted then and then only afterward informed the East Bloc leaders. It wasn't seeking their support per se, because the urgency of dealing with Cuba in October 1962 was so great that Soviet leaders really acted on their own, and only afterward informed East German, Czechoslovak, Polish leaders. At least those are the ones I've been able to find out that they consulted with and informed after the fact. But there was nothing done beforehand. In August 1961, and even a bit earlier, with going back to the 1958 Berlin crisis, and then in August 1961, and the subsequent standoff in October 1961 at Checkpoint Charlie, the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies are entirely eye-to-eye. No indication that there was any difference of view between Czechoslovak communists and Soviet communists about that crisis, or for that matter, about numerous earlier crises. 1956, the Suez Crisis is an interesting one because Czechoslovakia had its own relationship with Egypt, and that, if anything, just made Czechoslovak support for Soviet policy during the Suez Crisis even stronger. So there is no indication that during the major East-West crises of the 1950s and 1960s that Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union had any real different view.
Thank you. So we are running out of time, but let me ask the final question for today. Well, the research on the Czechoslovak communism increasingly focuses on the final period of the pre-1989 dictatorship. It is obvious that we have to see things in a broader context of the Eastern Bloc, I guess. So, where would you personally place the late Communist Party of Czechoslovakia on an imaginary pro-reform and anti-reform scale within the Eastern Bloc during Gorbachev's perestroika? Thank you.
Definitely, I would place it, with there were only two reformist parties at that point, and those were in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. I'm sorry, in Hungary and Poland, not in Czechoslovakia. Poland too, I would really qualify that. That in Poland, Jaruzelski later tried to depict himself as having been willing to go along with changes in Czechoslovakia. And there's no question Gorbachev liked Jaruzelski. But Jaruzelski was nowhere near the reformer that he made himself out to be. As late as 1989, he was still looking at plans for the reimposition of martial law in Poland. I don't think that there was any real serious hope that he could do it. But those plans are available now, and you can see that there was actually extensive planning that went on within the Polish General Staff and the Polish Internal Affairs Ministry in 1988 and 1989. Even though, again, I don't think that anyone seriously believed that it would be feasible to do, Jaruzelski was well aware that this was being done. Nonetheless, I will say Jaruzelski at the same time did go along, as did Czesław Kiszczak in Poland, with the talks that led to the round table and then the elections in Poland. So there was certainly a greater willingness to go along with the spirit of the times in the Soviet Union in Poland than there was in some other East Bloc countries. In Hungary, too, there was very much a reformist element. The Hungarian Communist Party had gotten rid of its longtime post-invasion leader after in 1988, and then he died in April 1989, May 1989. So the Hungarian Communist Party had moved on from János Kádár by that point and was really had brought in both a mixture of people, some of whom were not real reformers, but others like Imre Poschka who really were, and pushed for Hungary to move in the same way that the Soviet Union was. There was no other East Bloc country, and certainly not Czechoslovakia, in which that was the case. The Czechoslovak Communist Party was one of the hardline anti-reform communist parties. And that became all the more the case in 1989. And certainly the same was true in East Germany. There were interactions between East German and Czechoslovak leaders and also Romanian leaders, because they were all dead set against what was going on in the Soviet Union and in Poland and in Hungary. In Romania's case, it became shrill and hysterical to the extent that Ceausescu was calling for intervention in Poland to prevent Solidarity from taking power in August 1989. There was never anything like that in Czechoslovakia, but still there's no question that Miloš Jakeš, who had been brought in after Husak, from Husak in 1988, that the Jakeš regime was not a reformist one. It was very hostile to reform and very alarmed by what was going on in the Soviet Union and worried that the Soviet Union would abandon it, as it in fact it did. The March 1989 resolution that had been adopted by the Soviet Politburo that I mentioned was deliberately not disclosed to the Czechoslovak authorities or other East European regimes, certainly not to the East Germans, because they were worried that it would undermine their resolve and would basically hasten the potential or increase the potential for unrest in their countries, especially violent unrest. So they didn't disclose that they were not going to intervene, but I think that certainly in Czechoslovakia by late 1989, in the wake of Honecker's downfall, that there was a real anticipation that the Soviet Union wasn't going to intervene. And that's why, even though there were few people who perhaps hoped that violent repression could be used to suppress the unrest in Czechoslovakia, there was by that point a fatalism and acquiescence in what was happening. It wasn't, however, a pro-reform sentiment. There was no such sentiment after after 1969, after 1970 in the Czechoslovak Communist Party. It was not a reformist Communist Party, and anyone who thinks it as such is just grasping at straws.
Thank you. I think our time has come to an end. So thank you, Professor Kramer, for your lecture, for your reactions in the following discussions. And our conference will continue soon at 3:15 p.m. We have a panel dealing with party and society relationship during the pre-war and post-war Czechoslovakia. So
thank you very much again for inviting me to take part. I'm always delighted to take part in Institute events, and I'm especially happy in this anniversary year to be able to contribute at least a little bit to this important conference. I look forward to listening to the rest of it.
Thank you, and take care.